Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 80 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Calgary Flames and lost by a score of 5-2. And as was the case last week against Calgary, the Flames come in as an extremely desperate team here tonight, trying to maintain their spot in this Western Conference playoff race. In fact, the Sharks had the opportunity to play spoiler here tonight. Had they picked up a regulation victory, it would have essentially ended the Calgary Flames season right then and there. So that could have been potentially a little bit of motivation to get the Sharks going, but it is nothing compared to the motivation that the Flames players have, knowing that they were fighting for their playoff lives against the league's worst team. And so it is not that much of a surprise that the Sharks would end up coming out on the losing side of things, as they have done many times over these last couple of weeks, now on a 9-game losing streak. The fact is that they just don't have as much going for them as their opponents have had. At the beginning of this game, the Sharks actually looked pretty good. Their first few shifts of the game were really impressive, fully in the offensive zone. The first, second, third, and fourth lines all getting in on the action that ultimately ended up leading to this Tyler Toffoli goal, his 30th of the season, making it 1-0 San Jose. But unlike last matchup against Calgary, where it took the Flames a couple of periods before they really woke up and ended up picking up that victory, it pretty much happened instantly after this goal, where Calgary started to find their game a little bit, would eventually tie this one up with a goal from Mackenzie Weegar, and then another goal from Klapka makes it 2-1 Calgary after the first period. The second period, the Sharks would be the only team that gets on the scoreboard. That would be an unlikely suspect, Jan Ruda, putting it in. That would make it 2-2, but we found ourselves in a very familiar position for the Sharks. In fact, the same exact position as they were in just a couple of days ago against the Edmonton Oilers. And it is again showing that the Sharks just don't have as much going for them as other teams do, because the message from Ryan Warsofsky in this intermission is, well, let's go out and have a good third period so that we can try to pick up the win. But from the Flames coach, he can tell his players that if we don't win this period and if we don't come out on the winning side of this game, our season is done for. And to think, these types of threats are a lot more motivating. And so indeed, Calgary does come out. They score the first goal that ends up being the game winner. They add the insurance goal. And even when you would expect score effects to come into play and the Sharks to really start pushing, it never even really happens. And indeed, the Flames are able to close out a relatively easy game in this third period to make it a 5-2 clean regulation victory for themselves. They stay alive in the playoff race, and as I said, the Sharks' losing streak is further extended. They yet have to actually pick up a win here in the month of April. Moving on to the standings update. This is the final standings update of the season. As I said, this was a very real possibility of happening. In my last review, the Sharks were just one single point away from locking down last place, and I expected that it would happen by the end of this weekend, and indeed this Calgary Flames loss would have done it. But in fact, it wasn't the case that it was locked down here tonight, but it happened yesterday when the Chicago Blackhawks took on the President's Trophy winning Winnipeg Jets. I didn't expect much from this game. I thought the Jets would be able to take care of business, but in fact the Blackhawks fought pretty hard and ended up going all the way to the shootout before losing, but that gave them the single point necessary to lock down this last place position for San Jose. They will have the best possible draft lottery odds in a few weeks' time between rounds 1 and 2 in the playoffs when the NHL does that draft lottery. Now, obviously, it is nice to have that 25% chance of getting the first overall pick, and it worked out for San Jose last season, but it is still important to mention that indeed 25% chance to win means that there is a 75% chance for them to lose. And so it is not so much that getting last place is the key to getting the first pick, but there are a lot of other advantages that come with it. The first of which is that if another team does leapfrog the Sharks, let's say the Blackhawks win the lottery, or the Kraken, or the Bruins, or the Flyers, or the Sabres, or whoever, the Sharks, if they will then have the best odds to get second overall pick. And right now, top 2 in this draft seems to be pretty important. But even in a worst case scenario, because the Sharks are in last place, they have locked in a top 3 selection in the draft, compared to had they finished second last, it would only be a top 4. It is the difference between getting maybe a player who you really want and a player who is still good, but maybe was not at the top of your draft list. So this is a crucial opportunity, and now we can maybe more so enjoy the last couple of games of the season and be rooting for Sharks victories, knowing that it's not going to disrupt any possible draft lottery odds. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Smith, Celebrini, and Kovalenko. They had been playing rather well over these last few games. That Celebrini 5-point night and Smith 4-point night against the Minnesota Wild seems like a distant memory at this point, because here tonight it just didn't really look all that great, just couldn't really get anything going. And that does start off with Celebrini. He is the Sharks' best player. He is the driving force on that line. Obviously, Smith does a lot of good work here as well, but Celebrini is the guy at this point, and he just didn't really seem like he was rolling here tonight. Not a ton of puck touches for himself, and while defensively I do still think he was relatively solid, it was a fact that if he's not really going, this line is going to have some struggles here, and that was indeed the case in this game. When it comes to Will Smith, he did have he touched the puck a good bit more than Celebrini, I would say, but many of those times it would kind of lead to these giveaways. Nothing hugely dangerous usually, but just at moments in which you wouldn't actually manage to get any sort of offense generated for this line. And so again, didn't really look all that great. If there is a positive to say for Will Smith, it is that his forechecking ability has continued to come very, very far throughout this season. Over this hot streak, he has been so smart with the way he reads other teams' breakouts and why he is able to pick off passes so often. There was at least once or twice here tonight where he's able to pick off that opportunity and maintain possession in the offensive zone. Then we also saw him completely strip the puck away from the Flames' best defenseman that they have, Mackenzie Weegar. That was very impressive to see, especially since Smith is not a physically imposing player. In fact, he's probably the least physically imposing player on this Sharks roster, so he doesn't have that tool in his toolbox, and yet just because of his smarts and his ability to stick check, he is actually able to pull this off anyway. So there are still some positives here from Smith. On the bad side of things, his work on this first goal against by Weegar was not very impressive. At first, he gives this puck away, but what I actually thought was even worse than that was his inability to win the race to a puck near the blue line. I thought he would be able to dive at this one and swat it out of the zone, but he instead remains standing. The Flames are able to keep it in, and it ultimately ends up in the back of the net just a few seconds later. So I didn't really like that shift from Smith, but there were still some positives to pick out here tonight. And then when it comes to Nikolai Kovalenko, his game in this one, there were also some decently bright spots. What we saw here was his ability to stick handle in tight areas. There were a couple of moments where I really thought Kovalenko was going to end up losing possession, and yet he still managed to keep it and end up making a pretty good pass. So there are some values that he is able to bring to this top line that Celebrini and Smith have benefited from over these last couple of games. But the big thing about Kovalenko is that he needs to be more valuable offensively than he is a deficit defensively. This is something that Celebrini and Smith do very, very well, despite occasionally having some bad turnovers and making some mistakes, as was the case here for Smith on that Weegar goal. They provide so much boost to the Sharks offense that it is extremely forgivable. But with Kovalenko, is that actually similar case? Maybe, maybe not. And if you take a look at his play on this Coronado goal, it's just not really good enough. He's just not making enough of an effort to impede this pass or even this shot, as Coronado just zooms by him, sets himself up in the slot, and gets this easy goal. And it is eerily similar to another play a couple of games ago against the Minnesota Wild, where again Kovalenko is the one tasked with blocking this slot pass, and because he's hovering more so towards the point, he leaves Joel Eriksson-Ek all alone in front to also get an easy slot goal. These are things that are going to stand out to Ryan Warsofsky and make him believe that Kovalenko is not a trustworthy player, which is not a situation that Kovalenko, who already seems to be on a very, very short leash, wants to actually be in. And so I had originally thought Kovalenko would probably finish this season on this top line with Celebrini and Smith, simply because the Sharks didn't really have any other options to play here. But we did see a roster move made yesterday for a player to get called up from the San Jose Barracuda that could end up throwing a wrench into those plans. It is possible that by tomorrow's game against Vancouver, we could see a swap of personnel. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, this was definitely the Sharks' best on the night. I did think they looked pretty good, which is a great thing because they hadn't really been looking all that good over these last couple of games. And that does kind of start with Alex Wennberg. He had been very, very strong since the return of the Sharks from that Four Nations break. But over these last couple of games, he's fallen off. And while he was never like a big driving force, usually he's more of a complement to guys like Eklund or Toffoli, or back prior to that first first line being united. Will Smith was with him and was doing some great things, but he was always that strong foundational piece, and over these last couple of games, that hasn't quite been the case, and that has been a bit to the detriment of his line mates. Here tonight, while I don't think Wenberg was great, I do think he was better and was good enough to help out both of his line mates, who ended up having very good games. Starting off with Toffoli, he continues to be one of the most interesting players on this roster because he's not quite that level of dominant that we see from Celebrini and Smith and Eklund at times throughout this season, and yet you cannot really argue with the stats. 30 goals, you don't just fall backwards into, you don't just luck into that. You have to be doing something right, and here tonight, despite Toffoli not just completely dominating this game, the fact is he scored a goal and he had multiple other high danger chances as well. But I do think the standout player on this line was probably William Eklund. I think he had some great work in this game. The primary assist on the Jan Ruda goal was one of the best primary assists we have seen perhaps throughout this entire season thus far. Very, very impressive show of skill and poise in that exact position to be able to find Jan Ruda, who I would never expect to pinch down from the point, and Eklund, I guess, did and saw him doing so. He finds him in that area for that tap-in goal. So that was great to see. And generally, I thought Eklund pulled off some smart moves in this game to once more be the Sharks' potentially best player, I would even say. When it comes to the third line, obviously the standout player here does have to be Thomas Bordeleau. This was the roster move that I mentioned earlier on. This was the player who the Sharks called up from the Barracuda. And at first, I was excited to see this news. Obviously, I had made a video a few weeks ago discussing why the Sharks should call up at least one of Bordeleau and Gushin, and here we are with Greer having made that move. And yet, after that brief excitement, it kind of led to a little bit of frustration when you realize that there's only 3 games left on the schedule. The point I had made in that video was that the best time to call up one or both of these players was like multiple weeks prior to the video being made, and the second best time was right then and there, so that they at the very least could get the final 12 games of this season. Bordeleau only being able to get in for these final 3, it's just not really a good showing. This is not really going to give you a strong indication of what you have in this player. It reminds me of when the Sharks did the exact same thing with Gushin last year. They called him up for the final 2 games of the season, and a time that included a 9-goal loss to the Edmonton Oilers. Essentially, the rest of the roster had kind of packed it in and was just going through the motions to finish out this season. And while I do think this roster is a bit more mentally tough than that and is still trying to play, it is quite clear that we're not exactly getting their A game every single night, and that's just not really putting a Bordeleau into a position to succeed. Speaking of not putting him into a position to succeed, the line that he is on is also not very good. This was again a reason for why I wanted to see him actually called up when there were 12 games left, because this was at a time in which, let's say, Colin Graf was still on the roster, and so Graf could fill in the top 6, and you could have Bordeleau, let's say, play on a third line with Kovalenko, maybe even Patrick Giles, who isn't all that good offensively, but is at least a better option than Ostapchuk or Dellandrea in that center role. That could have been more of an interesting look, but instead we get Bordeleau with Ostapchuk and Grundstrom. Grundstrom is like barely a 13th forward, and Ostapchuk is essentially an AHL player, and so Bordeleau is not really given the chance and the tools to find success at this top level. It's hard to have expected much from him offensively. And then on top of that, even further, the ice time here for Bordeleau isn't really much to do with. He gets 10.5 minutes, which already at a baseline isn't really high for a third liner. You would expect him to be at least like 12-ish minutes at that point. When you take out power play ice time, however, it gets down to 10 minutes of even strength. And this is even further inflated by the fact that after the Flames scored this empty net goal, Bordeleau played a good minute and a half before the Flames would take that delay of game penalty and the game would finish off with a Sharks power play. And so realistically, through the first 57 minutes of this game, Bordeleau had about 8.5 minutes of ice time. That is just not really going to be a strong enough showcase. So he had a strong game to open up. As I mentioned, the first 5 minutes were heavily dominated by San Jose. Bordeleau was a part of that and helped set up a couple of really great chances when his line was on the ice. But then past that point, it felt as though there just really wasn't a ton doing. Rarely did Bordeleau even manage to cross the center ice line throughout much of this game. And you could say that that is his fault. You can say that it is Ostapchuk's fault and Grundstrom's fault or the team's fault. But all in all, this really wasn't a strong enough showcase to actually give a chance for Bordelot to show what he can actually do, which just feels very disappointing, I would say. When it comes to his actual game here tonight, offensively, I thought he did a couple of decent things. Defensively, I don't think he was a disaster. It's not as though the Flames were getting tons of high danger opportunities when he was on the ice. There were a couple of these weaker giveaways that weren't super dangerous, but still not something that you want to see. And then there were one or two moments, once in the first period where he's like standing in front of the Sharks net and looked kind of lost from a defensive standpoint. That obviously isn't great, but all in all, I don't think Bordelot was bad. But again, it's hard to have really expected the world from him. When it comes to his two line mates, Ostapchuk and Grundstrom, if I'm being honest, when those two players were on the ice, they were usually with Bordelot, who I was trying to keep a very close eye on in this particular game. So unless Ostapchuk and Grundstrom actually showed off immensely, which didn't really happen past the first 5 minutes here tonight, I didn't quite notice them that much. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, we then had Gregor with Dellandrea and Barclay Goodrow, a fourth line that showcased some decent talent in those first 5 minutes. They were actually partially on the ice when Toffoli scored this goal, his 30th of the season, which was nice to see. But besides that, they laid a few hits. It was like an okay-ish game, but more often than not, they were playing in the defensive zone. Nothing to write home about, nothing particularly special, nothing to get excited about either. When it comes to the defensive side of things, once more, it is a very short-handed group of players. I was very happy with the type of performance they were able to have the other night against the Edmonton Oilers, just based on the personnel that the Sharks were actually throwing out here. Remember, their top pairing right now is Liljegren and Thrun, which if you had seen as the Sharks' third pairing back at the beginning of the season, you still wouldn't even be that confident in it. While I think Liljegren is very, very serviceable as a third pairing defenseman, Thrun leaves a lot to be desired at this point, and this game was no different here. This was a pairing that the Sharks were trying to set up for being a potential shutdown group, and it just didn't work more often than not. Thrun's performance on this Klapka goal was really, really bad, and then Liljegren does not bail him out, and then Ty Dellandrea does not bail him out. In fact, this is actually the second game, to go back to Dellandrea a little bit, where he has a guy in front of the net, his man, who he just does not make any sort of strong enough effort to tie up. That's the type of mistake that if Bordelot was making, he'd get sent down to the ECHL, but I'm sure Dellandrea will be in the lineup for these next couple of games, because who cares, I guess. But when it comes to circling here to Henry Thrun, it's just a game that's just simply not good enough for Thrun. Yeah, the situation is tough. Yeah, this is a position where you are going up against a team that not only is better than you, but has a lot more motivation and is skating harder and is playing harder. So you're not really, if you're Henry Thrun here, you do kind of have the deck stacked against you. But at the same time, you're hoping for more of a better performance like we actually saw from Thrun 2 days ago against Edmonton, and yet these inconsistencies remain in his game. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, honestly, very much the same things. He continues to just not really be reliable enough in his zone. Yes, offensively, he can do some good things, and there are games in which he is just really managing to put things completely together, like in those 2 games he had against Toronto. But just at this moment, can you really see him as like a future top 4 guy for San Jose? Maybe not. Though as a third pairing defenseman, I don't think he'd be too bad, like I said a bit earlier. When it comes to the Sharks' second pairing, Karlsson and Ruda, despite Thrun and Liljegren at first sort of being postured as that top pairing, this was the grouping that actually had the most time on ice amongst San Jose Sharks defensemen. And Jan Ruda, I do once again have to commend him. I thought he was pretty good in his return game 2 days ago against Edmonton. And again here tonight, he was pretty good. Offensively, actually, Jan Ruda steps up in a big way. Not only does he score this goal, which I did not expect from him. This isn't just a random shot from the point, but he actually jumps into the play, puts himself in a position to score, and catches that great pass from William Eklund. But there was even another moment in which Jan Ruda was attempting to get involved and pinching down from the blue line. It was something that we had seen from Ferraro prior to his injury, and it seems as though Ruda has taken up the mantle as well. I do wonder if the sort of incoming off season has really hit Ruda, where he's beginning to realize hey, I'm on an expiring contract. I probably haven't played good enough to deserve any contract from any other team. And so I got to showcase that I can still play here. And so these last couple of games is him doing exactly that. Again, I am hopeful that the Sharks aren't going to be the ones to re-sign him. They already have Vincent Desharnais, who fills a very similar role and usually does it kind of better. But Jan Rutta, could he get an opportunity with another team as that Stanley Cup pedigree that he has? It's certainly possible. When it comes to his defensive partner, Lucas Carlsson, offensively, I do think he actually did some decent things. Like, as was the case the other night against Edmonton, he has begun to step up a little bit more in that role. It was something that he was doing well when he was first called up, then got away from it a little bit, and now he's starting to find his game in that area. But defensively, you do still leave a lot to be desired from a Lucas Carlsson side. The thing that's interesting about Carlsson is that positionally, I would say he's relatively sound. He usually does find himself in the strong positions, but the problem is that you can't just place yourself on the ice and say, hey coach, I'm in the right spot. You actually have to do something with your positioning. You actually have to block a pass. You actually have to tie up a stick. You actually have to take the man. You have to play physical, and Carlsson just doesn't really do that. And so even if he is in the correct spot, if he's not actually doing anything with that posturing, it doesn't actually lead to any sort of success. And it felt as though there were a couple of times in which, yeah, he is on top of a player, but he's not actually doing anything to the Flames player. And so they're easily able to take a shot, take a couple of whacks at it before Romanov is able to freeze. So Carlsson does need to improve in that area if he wants any sort of chance to being an NHL defenseman next season. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, we have Vlasic and Thompson. It should be noted, Thompson did not finish this game. Seems as though he left within the last few minutes of the game due to an injury. He had been playing okay-ish up to that point. Not great, but I don't think he was too terrible. And I think he was also sort of dragged down by Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who had a very strange game here tonight. Usually the case with Vlasic is that I can go through like a full 60 minutes barely noticing him, and that's actually a good thing for a player of Vlasic's caliber because he's not really going to provide much offensively, and so defensively, if he's not making huge mistakes, you're probably coming out on the winning side of things. But that wasn't the case here tonight with Vlasic, in particular in the first period. He was trying to make a lot of aggressive plays. The first two actually did work out, some really nice moves where he's like passing it off the wall to himself to get it out of pressure. And you're thinking, wow, Vlasic, is this, 2014 Vlasic reincarnated? And then as the first period wore on, he had two horrific giveaways in his own zone, leading to some great chances for the Calgary Flames. And you're like, okay, it's still 2025 Vlasic here, guys. And then in the second and third period, while he seemed to get back to that simple game, that first period was just too much of a hindrance, I would say, to his general performance here tonight. I don't think Vlasic played particularly well. And when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, we do have Georgi Romanov. He does get the start here tonight, which would normally be notable if the Sharks weren't playing tomorrow as well. Since this is a back-to-back, obviously Romanov was going to get one of these starts and Georgiev would get the other, which is going to be tomorrow against the Vancouver Canucks. Romanov here tonight, I don't think he was great. This Uyghur goal is one that was definitely stoppable. It's from rather far out, and the seas essentially parted for him to be able to see this puck, and it still ends up beating him cleanly. The Klapka goal, he has essentially no chance on. The Coronado one, this one is from a lot more close, so he certainly would have had a difficult time of making the save. But then the first Sharangovich one, if I recall correctly, he could have potentially made the save here. And so not the worst night for Romanov, but not the best either. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. They'll be taking on the Vancouver Canucks. Finally a team that has not happened that often as of late, but finally a team in which the Sharks are in a similar position to them. The Canucks are out of the playoff race. They don't have a ton to play for. Neither do San Jose. Can they finally break out of this losing streak? Hopefully they can actually pick up a victory before this season comes to an end. Class dismissed.